Hello everyone, welcome to your channel about conflict resolution and peace studies. I'm here with Miki Jacevic.
Perfect.
He's an expert in practitioner in conflict resolutions, peace building, and he has lived and worked in more than 60 countries. And this is the second video with him, so you can check the first one. And I would like to talk to you about restorative justice.
Sure.
And if you could give like intro about what is it, when do we use it, where is the right moment to use it, what's the challenge about it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and so first of all, it's a fairly new concept in terms of part of the peace building field. Obviously, it has a long history and tradition from places like Brazil to most of the native communities around the world, and the concept literally comes from the world of reconciliation, which is in Latin meaning reconciliare, literally means get back to the circle. So historically, most of the communities have resolved their disputes by sitting into circles, having certain rituals like a talking stick, having certain forms of apology and reparation. So restorative justice is this phenomenon that's based on ability of people to resolve their hurt by talking in a circle, to find ways to make amends, to repair relationships. And it's building on the concept of retributive justice, which is mostly what we are familiar with, which is the courts. And so how do we apply these concepts to the modern conflicts, where much of what happens is what I call domestication of violence. The war is no longer down there on the building field with the militaries. It's in our communities, it's in our homes, it's on our streets. Everybody is affected. Nobody's accepted. We don't have a choice. We feel it. Again, not all of us participate directly. We do have people with guns who do it, and we have police who try to stop it. But all of us are part of that violent story. And in order to society to move forward, for the community to move beyond it, there have been in the last 20, 30 years attempts to adapt the old systems of sitting in the circle to this modern violence. And much of it happens at the local level. The most famous example of really transforming a country, it's called Gacaca in Rwanda, and it literally means sitting on the grass, where the hundreds and hundreds of very small communities, if you can imagine 200, 300 people, have come together to discuss the horrible events of 20 years ago when the genocide was committed. And it's a very powerful story, and again, it's very complex, it's painful, it took 10 years, it requires a lot of preparation and skill, it requires a lot of moral courage, particularly from the survivors, but also from the people who were witnesses, who saw what happens, coming now back so many years to speak up and tell the truth of what has happened. So I see a lot of premise in restorative justice, but at the same time, I also want to say, as a practitioner of it, most of the time it is very difficult and it's a challenge to do it right. For three reasons. Number one, there's almost this human desire when you sit in the circle to push the victim to say, it's okay, I forgive. And that's very hard. Because there's this tendency, we are all together, we are all one community, we are all one family, and we all have suffered enough, it's time to move on. And there's this concept, there's a need to let go. And so I have seen a lot, for example, in Afghanistan, where you are forcing, particularly, for example, women in the community to say we can move on. You are really neglecting their part of the story. That every war now includes, for example, gender-based violence. And the reality that if we don't give women enough spaces, enough support, enough time, they cannot process it. So the challenge of restorative justice is that sometimes people can interpret it as we are forcing survivors to say it's okay. And for many of them, it should never be okay. So it always has to be very much victim or survivor centric. The second thing is the challenge of expecting the perpetrator to say, I'm sorry, expecting an apology. And if you've seen in a lot of these contexts, from the South African Truth Commission to what's happening even in Cambodia that you will visit, there's always this human desire to hear, and it's almost always these guys, these men, to say what I did is wrong. And it's just talking about practice, and that's all I know. While we can hope for that, we can expect it, it just does not happen. Because most of the perpetrators, for either the reasons of shame, self-preservation, psychological reasons, they actually are not able to say they're sorry. And we cannot expect that apology, and it's extremely hard. And it, again, even in the best of circumstances, I have not seen it happen. As I mentioned, of thousands and thousands of restorative circles, I have seen it maybe a handful 5 times, where the perpetrator stands up, addresses the victim, and says, I'm sorry. But when it does happen, like experience that I had in Northern Ireland, where the victims of the bombing of the IRA, which was their rebel group, really went into, and this happened in schools, when they addressed the youth, and they said to youth, we are sorry that we robbed you of the peaceful future. So it has that wow element when it happens, and yet it happens so rarely. And then the third thing is, for me, because again, you asked about challenges, and while I love it and I do it, the challenge is also, how do we then make it more systemic, more structural, beyond just the people in the circle? Because we need to change a society. It's not just that the victims and the perpetrators need to sit together. It is the reality that even in Brazil, most of people, frankly, don't know what's going on in the favelas.
No, they
It
don't.
does not affect them day to day. And it's happily, how do we ignore it? And that's not okay. That restoration means that we learn, we understand what's wrong, we, as you have done here beautifully, understand the root causes. We all work to address it. We don't judge, that's the point, but we do change. We have to change, because restoration, it literally means, how do we create conditions where we are very clear what's wrong and what's right.
Yes. Wow. That's very challenging. And usually, if you're doing a restorative justice, that means that the conflict's already over,
Yeah.
right? Because if it's on, then it's not going to work because we're not ready to that kind of, But can you do it immediately when the conflict's finished? Is there a time that you need to wait? People needs to
Yeah.
agree with it?
Yeah. So I personally, because my work is mostly in the violent war zones where people had ethnic groups have been killing each other, etc. So it's much more physical violence, and it was very traumatic for the whole society. So in my opinion, there's a bit of a distinction there. To do restorative justice in a way that's going to rebuild relationships, you need time. Because you need, frankly, honestly, you need to physically replay the place. You can't sit like when my war ended in Bosnia, my whole hometown was in ruins.
Yeah.
You could not find an actual building to sit and talk. So to come and tell people, let's discuss what happened, you could not physically do it because the reminders of the war were everywhere.
Too painful.
So there are, I think, in big picture conflicts, it's too soon. I typically say it's really 10 to 15 years.
After?
Yes, because
wow.
you need to rebuild the country. You need to give people the sense that peace is real,
Yes.
that we can discuss this now without going back to violence. However, there are forms of using principles of restorative justice, even at the height of conflict, which is all about dialogue, which is all about what is called narrative mediation, which is how do we use some of these tools that are victim-centric, that are communal, and that allow people to just talk about it.
Yep.
Because the challenge is, so we can't call it restorative justice because we're not restoring anything. But what we are doing, even in the middle of conflict, and that's where I love dialogue,
Yep.
and it does not have to always be in terms of sitting down talking, using martial arts, focusing on the young people, using a lot of sports arts in general. In many countries, people want to save face, so they're never able to process this emotion, but they can draw. They can do video. They can go talk to their grandmother. There are always forms, but the key here is that what is a nonviolent way for us, particularly to allow the victims to be the center of our attention.
All right. So again, you see how challenging our field is and how exciting, but also people need to be very brave and very,
Yes.
very resilient.
Correct.
And even though,
Correct.
because some people think we are
Correct.
resilient because we work in this field, but we need people in the field that are extremely resilient, that make us feel touched because they are so resilient. That's
right.
unbelievable, right?
That's why we do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you. Great job.